Okay, this is Interpreting Contemporary Culture, and I want to welcome you to our third overall session and our second session of actual lecture material. And this session is entitled Defining the Boundaries. One of the things that I hope you can grow into, not only in your academic career, but also in your ministry career, is learning to define your terms. One of the critical aspects to any ministry is learning to define the terms, especially when questions are asked of us. We can answer questions so much better if we begin to try and articulate the boundaries that we have to work with. The boundaries will help establish for us expectations, and it will better help us focus in on what really the question is that we're trying to answer. So, as we get into another session of interpreting contemporary culture, and we take another step forward in trying to understand the culture that surrounds us, one of the things that I want to do with you is to encourage you to define culture. In fact, this week in our discussion board, I'm going to be asking a question of you about defining the parameters that properly define this far-reaching concept of culture, this thing that seems to be everywhere and yet is so often misunderstood or misconstrued. And so that's what this lecture really is all about. How do we define the boundaries? We're going to begin to look at a variety of authors throughout the ages that have gone about identifying culture. And then at the end, I'm going to give you some identifying marks that I've found of elements, at least, of this definition. So defining the terms just is really, really important, especially with what some may consider a slippery term, a term that could just easily be misunderstood in the wrong sorts of contexts. So we need to try and define it. We can often throw out terms without really knowing how to use them, or think of several different things with this same term. Culture can be used in negative ways, and many times is used in negative ways in Christian culture or Christian circles in regards to that which is out there, and it's often defined negatively, like world is in John's Gospel. So the advantage in definition is that we wrestle together to give definition to and give body to a concept that often goes misunderstood. One of the primary books that you're reading, in fact, the only required textbook for this class, Livermore, writes, defining culture is much like defining air. We know what it is. We live in it. It lives in us. We can't see it, but it's there just the same. Livermore puts his thumb on the issue here. Culture is all around us. I hope that you enjoy Keller's reading from the chapters on Moodle in regards to the fact that the gospel that we want to preach, that we want to construe in a culturally relevant way, is not a cultureless gospel. We can't preach the gospel, we can't give the gospel in a cultureless way. And so defining it is kind of like trying to maybe discover the atoms or the electrons and neutrons or the particular elements of air or water if I were a fish. So we're going to try and define these elements very carefully. There's some definition options from some of the top minds of yesterday and today. This has been an ongoing issue for Christians of many centuries, and certainly within the 20th and 21st centuries. One of the definitions that caught my eye maybe 2 years ago as I was beginning to try and refine the study of defining the boundary of culture is this. I can't remember where I got it, but I enjoyed it. Culture is a combination of family and national heritage. Think about it for a minute. As a people group, Americans as a whole, part of our culture is to enjoy a national heritage. Oftentimes we can't agree on who to vote for, what kind of politics we will have. But when it comes time for the Olympics, let's say, oftentimes we find that we can stand next to brothers and sisters of the American national heritage, and irregardless of our political or religious affiliations or how much we may in otherwise dislike one another or disagree with one another outside of this venue, it seems that we share a national heritage to be able to root on our favorite players or our favorite team or make chants of USA, USA. I experienced this recently even as I was watching swimming with my daughter, and Michael Phelps happened to be swimming. And on his return to try and remake the Olympic team, and we found ourselves glued to the television, going, chanting USA, cheering on. And this is part of my culture. This is part of how I grew up, and this is certainly a part of now my daughter's national heritage. Part of culture is understanding who we are. I hope that as you are going through Livermore's really quite brilliant book on cultural intelligence and what he calls CQ, raising your cultural quotient, I hope that you are taking time to do some of those quizzes that he offers to you, in particular the one in regards to, are you a good American? Do you eat creamy peanut butter? Those kinds of things. Some of those things might seem silly to you and I. However, there is a part of this culture that we're a part of in which we have biases because of where we've come from and who we are and what language we speak and what area of the world we've happened to live in. So we share a cultural family and national heritage. I know that if we boil the national heritage in a much smaller unit, we have families. Of course, lots could be made of our culture in regards to what the family is and how we go about defining that. This seems to be a rather political battle. What is the family? Is the family mom and dad who've never been divorced and have 2 children? And for some, this is the definition of family, is the definition of family just people that we happen to be around. So we could go into the sociological aspects of that. All I simply want to say here is it's indeed true that culture is part of who we are as family, however we might go about defining that, and national heritage. Duvall and Hayes, interestingly enough, in their interpretation book, in their hermeneutics book, write this about culture. Culture is what you learn. You learn it from your mom at breakfast, from the kids on the playground at school, and from television. It is a mix of language, customs, stories, movies, jokes, literature, and national habits. For Americans, it is comprised of Big Macs, Barbie dolls, Tiger Woods, and the Backstreet Boys. I add Lady Gaga here. All mixed in with George Washington, Babe Ruth, the Mississippi River, Walmart, and the space shuttle. It's interesting to me that within this definition of culture, of what we're learning, we have a variety of what might be considered cultural goods that Duval and Hayes choose to highlight symbols of how we go about learning. Things like Big Macs and Barbie dolls are national heritages in there as well, with George Washington and Babe Ruth, but Walmart and the space shuttle. So there are cultural goods, some might say cultural texts. There are things out there that, they help shape us. I was reading recently in an N.T. Wright book, and I was struck by the fact that in this book, all about the New Testament and coming to understand the background to the New Testament, there was a shockingly culturally relevant quote that I want to share with you here. Wright says this, but how do we study societies and their worldviews? He's talking about cultural relevance here. By means of their symbols, their characteristic behavior, and their literature. Particularly the stories they tell explicitly and implicitly. Societies and cultures reveal their worldviews by the cultural objects they produce, from banknotes to bus tickets, from skyscrapers to subway cars, from pottery to poetry, from temples to Torah scrolls, from military emblems to funerary monuments, from gymnasia to amulets. Symbols provide the interpretive grid through which humans perceive both how the world is and how they might act within it. They provide a vision of reality and a vision for it. Symbols cluster around the characteristic behavior of a society and vice versa. The celebration of festivals, the regular means of dealing with dissonance, the rituals associated with birth or puberty, marriage and death. And in many cultures, symbol and characteristic behavior are also focused in literature of all sorts. It is by studying these things that the historian can uncover the worldview of any culture and thus set the stage for inquiring about the mindsets of individuals within that society. And so where N.T. Wright looks really to try and uncover mindsets of ancient cultures, I think he's stumbled across something not only for symbols of ancient culture, but present and contemporary culture. He's talking about these things. I'm going to call them cultural goods. He calls them symbols. But these cultural goods that are a part of our everyday life, he notes them: banknotes, bus tickets, skyscrapers, subway cars, and even talks about some of our heritage, how we handle birth and death, puberty, marriage, characteristic behavior, all of these things that we have that are part of who we are as a culture. And so he says, hey, if we want to uncover something, we also need to be willing, ready, and able to look at the cultural goods and then what lies beneath. If all of this is true, then defining the boundaries isn't just about trying to stick our nose in a book. It's also about being very aware of what's going on around us. Who are we? What are our own cultural biases? What are the cultural goods that we have? What are the cultural goods of others that are different around us? And what lies beneath that? It's interesting in Livermore's book, in chapter 5, I believe, in Getting Below the Surface, he asks the question, well, what is culture anyway? Which, of course, is the question we're asking ourselves this afternoon. He talks about culture and uses the metaphor of a giant glacier. And he's sure to take note that there are cultural artifacts, otherwise known as symbols or cultural goods. He says there are things that we can see. There are art and clothing and food and money and customs and gestures. There's all of this. There's language and dress and our food customs and our And well, there's Tiger Woods and Barbie dolls and Walmart and iPhones and Apple computers and IBM and all of these different things, all of these different goods. And yet at its core, what really this is showing is the cultural values, the assumptions, the beliefs, the perceptions, the feelings that lie underneath all of that. So we look at what's above in order to try and define what's really below. What's at the heart of all of this? The glacier requires cultural goods through which we begin to evaluate what's below the surface. And gang, that's what this class really is all about. Why do we want to define culture? We want to know what's below the surface. What are the values that are driving our society right now? What are the belief systems that are out there that we can better minister to if we'll just take the time to try and evaluate what's above the surface so that we can understand the beliefs and the assumptions and the perceptions, etc., that lie below the surface. So in his book, Livermore writes, culture represents the way a group of people organize their ideas and their lives. If we're going to help people organize their lives around the gospel, then we also need to understand how they organize their lives now so that we can best bring the gospel in a relevant way. Richard Niebuhr, one of the top culture experts, really, of the 20th century. He brought Christianity and culture together. He popularized some of these ideas. And he says this: culture is the artificial secondary environment superimposed on the natural. It comprises language, habits, ideas, beliefs, customs, social organization, inherited artifacts, technical process, and values. A river is nature. A canal is culture. A raw quartz is nature. An arrowhead is culture. A moan is nature. A word, culture. So we begin to ask key questions of what we see and what we experience. So the result is the articulation of values, assumptions, beliefs, feelings, worldview, etc. We want to make sure that we understand that which is of nature and that which is of culture. And so many things, cultural goods being primary, help us begin to understand what's valued. For example, Niebuhr writes of an arrowhead being culture. If you and I run across an arrowhead, maybe out in the field, we can begin to piece together, if we want to become archaeologists, of what kind of worldview that certain society or that particular subculture of Native Americans had. We understand that they valued hunting and maybe even warring or protecting themselves. But we begin to piece together what was underneath the surface by what is above the surface. It's not only about what we come into the world. We come into the world, naked as the day we were born. It's raw and it's natural, yes. But it's not only what we come into, but also what we create with what we've been given. That's so important. And Niebuhr here highlights the idea. Kluckhohn and Kroeber write, culture is a pattern of thinking, feeling, and reacting to various situations and actions. Notice just so far in all of the definitions that we have been able to look at that there are these cultural norms, if you will. And some of these norms lead to how we think and act and react in given situations, both positively and negatively. Becker writes, culture is the shared understandings people use within a society to align their actions. So again, actions are present, while culture is defined, created, and transmitted through interaction, meaning we all agree to align our actions in a certain way. We all agree that stopping at a stop sign is a good thing and obeying the lines on the roads. But we're defined through the interaction of what we decide through our actions. It's not the interaction itself, but the content, meanings, and topics of the interaction. So when we talk about abortion or we talk about police shootings or we talk about politics or religion or Jesus, these things, the interactions and the contents, meanings, and topics of the interactions help begin to define really what's at the core, what's below the surface of some of those things. Hofstede writes this, culture is the collective programming of the mind that distinguishes the members of one group from another. It's the software behind how we operate. Again, what's below the surface. Schein writes, culture is the way a group of people solve problems and reconcile dilemmas. Geertz writes, cultures are comprised of webs of significance that people spin and in which they themselves are suspended. Very, very interesting. Gordon Lynch, in his book called Understanding Theology and Popular Culture, simply writes, culture is the shared environment, practices, and resources of everyday life in a given society. So you have begun, hopefully, to kind of piece together for yourself some of the parameters, the elements to this thing that we're calling culture. That maybe there's many complex moving parts that come together in an agreed pattern of living in any given society that helps determine what is at the heart and core of who we are. Jay Clifford writes, culture is a deeply comprised idea and I cannot yet be without it. I love that quote and really, really enjoyed it. I think what he's saying is, I know that I may not be able completely to define culture, but I know that I cannot do without culture. Timothy Keller, of course, writes this, culture is popularly conceived narrowly as language and music and art, food and folk customs. Again, these would be what we might consider cultural goods or texts or symbols. But properly understood, it touches every aspect of how we live in the world. Culture takes the raw materials of nature and creates an environment. Remember what Niebuhr said. He says, there is that raw quartz, that's nature. But when we find the arrowhead made out of the quartz, that is culture. We do all this, Keller writes, to bring the natural order into the service of particular commanding truths, core beliefs, and assumptions about reality and the world we live in. Culture affects every part of human life. And I agree. Culture affects every part of human life. That's why we have to define it. That's why we have to engage it for the sake of the gospel. Linwood Barney, in Keller's book, writes, culture resembles an onion. The inmost core is a worldview, a set of normative beliefs about the world. Out of that layer is a set of values, then a set of human institutions. Finally comes the most observable part of culture, human customs and behavior, material products, the built environment, and so on. And so again, I return to Livermore and his metaphor of the glacier. There is something deeply rooted at the heart of who we are as human beings that goes about creating culture. We can't get away from it. It's part of who we are. It's about values and how we see the world in which we live. And eventually, it makes itself known in the natural world, in the world that we live in, and how we act and what we wear and the language that we speak, and so on. So, what are the elements given above do you find to be the most essential for defining the parameters to the concept of culture? I'm going to give you the opportunity in a discussion board to answer some of those very questions. In particular, what do you find to be the most crucial elements to this whole thing about defining culture? But before you do that, let me give you some of the elements that I find in each one of these definitions of culture from now and from men in the past. Here's some key elements that I see to defining culture. The first one is this: there has to be like people groups. I don't necessarily mean like people groups by ethnicity or the language that they speak, but oftentimes that is the case. Oftentimes there are like people groups and they come together because they have some common bond. They have some like ethnicity or language. But any culture has to have like people groups, whether that's a small like people group or a large like people group. This just seems to be one of the overarching elements to defining culture. Another element that I am finding as I go through consistently in all of these definitions of culture is that there are norms of interacting with people via cultural goods. Cultural goods, again, are that growing product that help define what is below the surface of values, of beliefs, of assumptions. Things like language and customs and artifacts and how we go about life together, about how we go about driving down the highway, about how we go about shopping at the same places. These things and how we interact with them seem to be a part of defining the boundary, the parameters to how we should begin to think about culture. The third element that I found is norms of thinking that establish similar mindsets and worldview. Maybe this should even be at number 2, while the other is at number 3. At the core of that onion seems to be mindsets and worldview, how we think. And if you know something about worldview, you probably recognize that how we think is going to determine how we are going to act. In fact, one of the issues brought up in Keller's book, Center Church, when it talks about culture, was James Hunt's definition of getting at culture. He writes this: culture is a normative order by which we comprehend ourselves, others, and the larger world, and through which we order our experience. At the heart of culture is a system of norms and values. But these norms and values are better understood as commanding truths so deeply embedded in our consciousness and in the habits of our lives that to question them is to question reality itself. He begins to get at when he says, these norms and values are better understood as commanding truths so deeply embedded in our consciousness and in the habits of our lives that to question them is to question reality itself. He's saying culture is part of who we are. It's to the core of our being. It's to the heart. It's embedded inside of us. And so we begin to try and question our own biases and look at our own worldview and our own way of thinking And when we begin to do that, we begin to understand and try and define at its most central place culture as we understand it. Those values, those norms, those truths that are deeply embedded in our consciousness, those habits that we have, that we begin to try and understand who we really are, and even better to understand who others are. So we understand norms of thinking that establish similar mindsets and worldview that act as a basis for beliefs and values. If we can begin to understand mindset and worldview, then we can begin to understand how we can present the gospel in relevant ways. We can love people in relevant ways that attach themselves to their kind of value system, that attach themselves to their mindsets and worldview. It becomes a strategic move on our part to begin to understand the other, as Livermore would call them. So we have norms and values which force us to know ourselves well, even before we seek to know others well. This, in my mind, is one of the key elements to trying to define culture. The last element really that I undertook, although I'm sure there's others that we might be subcategories of one of these, is the actual physical intent of people or people groups to actively create new cultural products. In number 2, the second element that I gave you is the interacting with people via cultural goods. So we have to interact with the things that we have. But there has to be also the actual physical intent of people to create new cultural products. In Crouch's book, one of the interesting things that he says about culture and cultural goods is this. He says if culture is to change, it will be because some new, tangible or audible or visible or olfactory thing is presented to a wide enough public that it begins to reshape their world. In other words, what he's saying is there has to be some created cultural good that so many people begin to share that it actually changes how we perceive culture. That it actually might begin to change how we view, how we think, and as a result, culture is changed. Some of these things might be easy for us to recognize. Things like the internet. We can't even imagine a world without the internet. We can't imagine a world where information isn't 2 clicks away, or we can't video chat with someone in Africa or China. But this is revolutionary. People have actively created some new cultural good that has affected billions and billions of people, and now also has affected how we go about thinking. The action of people and people groups creating new things shapes new ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. So we go about thinking, feeling, and doing differently by new things that are constantly being presented to our senses. Our culture might change because of one of these things, but not necessarily an entire culture. So, if we are changed, we have a bias of our culture. Not necessarily a bad bias. It might be a great bias, but something that we may need to recognize as we try and engage the other in another culture. Henry Van Til, again as a quote in Keller's book, writes, "Culture is any and all human effort and labor expended on the cosmos to unearth its treasures and riches and bring them into service to something." If we're going to define the boundaries of culture, then one of the things that I think is an element to this culture that we want to define is people going about creatively making something of the world that we live in. I think Crouch is absolutely right when he talks about culture and the definition of culture being what we make out of it. So, I hope that you'll take this lecture and you'll make something out of it. I hope that you'll look and try and define what do you think the key elements are, and really begin to try and ask yourself, okay, what does a manhole cover say about the way things are, or the way things should be? Or what does it make possible or impossible? Again, Crouch asks those questions that I asked you to review last week in chapter 1 of his book. But begin to think of the cultural goods, and then think of chapter 5 in Livermore, and begin to ask yourself the question, I can see certain things. I can see Lady Gaga dressing up in a meat suit. But what does that really say about our culture? What are the songs and the lyrics or the movies or the editing styles? What do they say about who we are? And what do they say about our core, our worldview, how we think, our belief systems, our values? So my challenge to you is this. Begin to look at the things that are above the surface, and begin to ask the key questions that try and say, how do I define culture? So that I can try and look and peer into the heart of where people are. Again, with the motivation of being